Good morning and welcome to Mrs. Jensen's audiobooks. Today we're going to be reading the Act II Summaries of Romeo and Juliet. So we have finished Act 1 where Romeo and Juliet meet at a party, they fall in love, and they find out that they are parts of rival families. So Romeo is a Montague, Juliet's a Capulet, and their families hate each other. So now in Act 2 we see what happens. So our prologue, which is like our narrators come out and they remind us of what's going on, and then we'll read by scene. So first in the prologue, the chorus delivers another short sonnet describing the new love between Romeo and Juliet. The hatred between the lovers' families make it very difficult for them to find the time or place to meet and let their passion grow. But the prospect of their love gives them each the power and determination to overcome any obstacles placed in their path. Scene 1. Having left the party, Romeo decides he can't go home. He must instead try to find Juliet. He climbs a wall bordering the Capulet property and leaps down into the orchard. Benvolio and Mercutio enter, calling out for Romeo. They're sure he's nearby, but Romeo does not answer. Frustrated and amused, Mercutio makes fun of Romeo's feelings for Rosalind in an obscene speech. Scene 2, the famous balcony scene. Juliet suddenly appears at a window right above where Romeo is standing. Romeo compares her to the morning sun, far more beautiful than the moon it replaces. He almost speaks to her, but decides to wait. So Juliet, talking to herself, and unaware Romeo is right below her, standing in her garden, asks why Romeo must be Romeo, a Montague, and therefore an enemy. She says if Romeo refuses his name, she would give herself to him. Or if he would simply swear he loved her, she would refuse her Capulet name. Romeo responds to Juliet, surprising her a little since she thought she was alone. Juliet worries that Romeo will be murdered if he's found in the garden. After all, he's a Montague on the Capulet property. But Romeo refuses to leave, claiming that Juliet's love will save him from his enemies. Juliet admits she feels strongly about Romeo as he professes his love to her, but she stops him, concerned that everything is happening too quickly. He reassures her, and the two confess their love again. The nurse, Juliet's nanny, calls for her. She goes inside for a moment. When she reappears, she tells Romeo she'll send someone to him the next day to see if his love is real and if he plans to marry her. The nurse calls again, and again Juliet has to run back inside. She appears at the window one more time to set a time when her messenger should call on him. They decide on 9 in the morning. They confess their love to each other for another moment before saying goodnight. Juliet goes back inside her bedroom, and Romeo departs in search of a monk to aid him in setting up a secret wedding. Scene 3. In the early morning, Friar Lawrence enters the scene, holding a basket with various weeds, herbs, and flowers. So back then, Friar Lawrence, a friar would be like a priest today. They also functioned as pharmacists. So not only were they in charge of like religious advising, but they would also create medicine out of herbs. Romeo enters, and Friar Lawrence notices that Romeo has not slept the night before. The friar fears Romeo may have spent the evening with Rosalind. Romeo assures him that did not happen and describes his new love for Juliet, his plan to marry her, and his hope that the friar will agree to marry them that very day. Friar Lawrence is shocked at the sudden shift from Rosalind to Juliet. He comments on the inconsistency of young love, Romeo's in particular, and criticizes that Romeo changes his mind too quickly. Romeo defends himself, arguing that Juliet feels the same way. Remaining skeptical at Romeo's sudden change of heart, Friar Lawrence still agrees to marry the couple. He only agrees in the hope that the marriage of Romeo and Juliet might finally end the feud, destroying the Montagues and Capulets. Scene 4. Later that morning, just before 9, Mercutio and Benvolio wonder what happened to Romeo after the party. Benvolio has learned from a Montague servant that Romeo did not return home. Mercutio begins to say some unkind words about Rosalind. Benvolio also relates that Tybalt, Juliet's cousin, has sent a letter to Romeo challenging him to a duel. Now remember, back then, if someone challenged you to a duel, it was fight to the death. Mercutio responds Romeo's already dead, struck by Cupid's arrow, and he wonders aloud whether Romeo is man enough to defeat Tybalt in a fight. When Benvolio comes to Romeo's defense, Mercutio launches an extended description of Tybalt. He describes Tybalt as a master swordsman, perfectly proper and composed in his fighting style. Romeo arrives. Mercutio immediately begins to make fun of him, claiming that Romeo has been made weak by love. Then Mercutio accuses Romeo of abandoning his friends the previous night. Romeo does not deny ditching his friends, but claims his need was great, and so the mistake is forgivable. The nurse enters, trailed by the servant Peter. The nurse asks if any of the three young men know Romeo, and Romeo identifies himself. Mercutio teases the nurse, insinuating that she's a harlot, thus infuriating her. Benvolio and Mercutio take their leave to have dinner at Montague's house, and Romeo says he will meet them there. The nurse warns Romeo that he better not attempt to deal double with Juliet or be fake to her, and Romeo assures her that he is not. He asks the nurse to tell Juliet to find some way to attend confession at Friar Lawrence's cell that afternoon. There they will be married. The nurse agrees to deliver the message. The nurse also agrees to set up a ladder so Romeo can sneak into Juliet's room on their wedding night. Back at the Capulet house, Juliet impatiently waits for the nurse, whom she sent to meet Romeo 3 hours earlier. At last, the nurse returns, and Juliet anxiously presses her for news. The nurse claims to be too tired, sore, out of breath to tell Juliet what has happened. Juliet grows frantic, and eventually the nurse gives in and tells her Romeo is waiting at Friar Lawrence's cell to marry her. The nurse leaves to wait in the alley for Romeo's servant, who is to bring a ladder for Romeo to use to climb up to Juliet's chamber that night after they are married. Scene 6. Romeo and Friar Lawrence wait for Juliet to arrive at the cell. An ecstatic Romeo recklessly states that he does not care what misfortune might come, as nothing bad could compare to the joy he feels right now. Friar Lawrence counsels Romeo to love without too much intensity, saying, "Violent delights have violent ends." Foreshadowing much? Juliet enters, and with the help of Friar Lawrence, they get married in a secret ceremony. The end of Act 2.